The sky was overcast, the air still. Inside a low concrete bunker on the coast, the hum of generators filled the stale air. Two German radar operators leaned over their glowing scopes, green lines sweeping in perfect rhythm. For hours, the screens had been quiet. Too quiet. Not a single contact, not even a faint blip from across the channel. Oberfeldwebel Hans Kruger rubbed his eyes. The Allies had been bombing every night for weeks. Silence was impossible. He glanced again at the cathode ray tube. Nothing. Only the endless sweep of the trace. Then, in an instant, the room came alive. The scope bloomed with light. Hundreds of returns all at once. The operators froze. It looked like an entire fleet was coming across the channel. Hundreds of aircraft, perfectly spaced, moving fast. The duty officer shouted for confirmation from neighboring stations, but they all reported the same thing. The sky was full. Alarms screamed. Spotlights swung east. Anti-aircraft crews ran to their guns. Every radar station along the coast was seeing the same impossible storm of echoes. But outside, the horizon was empty. The night sky above the bunkers remained silent until the ground began to tremble. Far above the clouds, American P-51 Mustangs swept inland, unseen and untracked. Behind them, silver strips of aluminum. Window drifted slowly toward Earth, reflecting radar waves like ghosts. Down below, the Germans fought phantoms. Up above, the real war was already overhead. The war for the invisible skies. Radar, deception, and the battle for Europe. By 1944, Germany's war machine no longer relied on tanks or trenches to defend Europe. Its real shield was invisible, an intricate web of radio waves stretching from the French coast to the North Sea, from Denmark to Brittany. This was the Kammhuber Line, a vast radar network designed to detect, track, and destroy Allied bombers long before they reached their targets. Every radar dish, every beam, every plotting table in that system represented years of innovation. The Germans had been the first to field radar in combat. Their Freya and Würzburg systems could spot aircraft from over 100 miles away. Linked by radio and ground controllers, they formed a seamless chain of detection. No formation could cross without being seen. To the Luftwaffe, radar was certainty, a godlike power that made the night transparent. And in a war where the British and Americans bombed mostly by darkness and cloud, certainty was survival. By late 1943, that certainty was under siege. The Royal Air Force had shifted its focus from precision raids to total war, firebombing Hamburg, Essen, and Berlin in massive waves of bombers. The Luftwaffe's Night Fighter Command, led by General Joseph Kammhuber, fought back with radar-guided interception, vectoring Me-110s and Ju-88s into the bomber streams. Entire British formations disappeared under the guns of radar-directed fighters. The Allies had to find a way to blind that system. Not destroy it, but deceive it. That challenge fell not to a bomber squadron, but to a handful of scientists in a windowless room at Malvern College, the British Telecommunications Research Establishment. They were radar engineers, mathematicians, and physicists, men like Joan Curran and Robert Cockburn, who studied the very frequencies German radar used. The idea they proposed was disarmingly simple. If radar depended on returning echoes, then perhaps the skies could be filled with false echoes. Their solution looked almost laughable. They cut thin strips of aluminum foil, half the length of a radar wavelength, and dropped them into the air. Each strip reflected a signal like a tiny mirror, creating thousands of phantom aircraft on radar screens. In theory, a few bundles of these strips could make a small formation look like an armada. The project was codenamed Window. It was so effective in tests that it scared everyone. Churchill's advisors feared that if the Germans discovered it, they would use it against Britain, blinding coastal radar and leaving the nation exposed. For almost a year, the idea sat classified, untested, hidden under piles of secrecy and fear. But by mid-1943, with Allied bombers being cut down nightly, The RAF could wait no longer. On July 24, 1943, during Operation Gomorrah, the bombing of Hamburg, the British used window for the first time. The result was chaos. German radar screens exploded with thousands of false contacts. Controllers ordered interceptors into empty skies. Flak batteries fired blind. For the first time since the Blitz, the night sky above Germany belonged entirely to the bombers. Hamburg burned for 8 days and nights, and the Luftwaffe couldn't stop it. That moment changed the course of the air war. The British had not just attacked a city, they had attacked the German sense of certainty. Soon, the Americans adapted the same method for daylight raids. When the 8th Air Force began escorting heavy bombers deep into occupied Europe with long-range P-51 Mustangs, they combined raw firepower with invisible deception. Window would hide their approach, jam radar, and draw German defenses to phantom targets. The result was elegant, terrifying, and nearly unstoppable. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe had begun calling it Duppel, their name for the strange falling metal that blinded their radars. They knew what it was, but they had no way to stop it. Every time the thin strips drifted from the sky, the German defense network saw ghosts, fleets that didn't exist, formations that vanished, and empty skies that suddenly filled with death. The radar war had entered its most dangerous phase. The Allies had learned not just how to fight the Luftwaffe, but how to erase themselves from the enemy's eyes. The science of disappearing. How window turned radar into chaos. In the sterile calm of a laboratory, window was nothing more than a handful of aluminum foil. In the skies over Europe, it became one of the most ingenious and devastating weapons of the war. The secret lay in something invisible, the wavelength of radar itself. Every radar system, whether German or Allied, transmitted radio waves that bounced off metal objects and returned as echoes. The size of the target didn't matter, only how well it reflected. A single strip of metal, if it matched half the wavelength of the radar beam, could create a return as bright as an aircraft. The Germans' Freya early warning radars used a wavelength of about 2.4 meters, the Würzburg gun-laying radars, 50 centimeters. So British engineers cut aluminum foil into strips of exactly 30 centimeters by 2 centimeters, bundled them into packets, and taught air crews to throw them out by hand. Once released, they drifted slowly downward, spreading into shimmering clouds that stayed aloft for miles. On radar screens, those clouds appeared as solid formations of aircraft. The effect was instant and overwhelming. When window was dropped, operators saw their clean, linear traces dissolve into storms of light. Nothing could be tracked. Real aircraft vanished among phantom echoes. The very system built to bring order to the sky became blind. But the brilliance of window wasn't just in its physics, it was in its timing and tactics. In daylight operations, American bomber groups released window in rhythmic intervals, creating moving walls of false targets. These phantom formations drifted in predictable directions, tricking radar operators into following them, and leaving entire sectors undefended. Meanwhile, the real formations, hidden behind the clutter, approached untracked. During Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, the Allies dropped window across the Channel in massive quantities. German radar screens filled with ghost fleets that seemed to be sailing toward Calais instead of Normandy. When the real invasion began, hours later, entire divisions of German troops were waiting in the wrong place. For the American 8th and 9th Air Forces, window became as standard as ammunition. Crews learned how to use it with precision, dropping packets in specific patterns, adjusting altitude and wind drift. Bomber navigators carried stopwatches just for timing window releases, their calm mechanical actions masking the fact that they were erasing their own existence from enemy detection. The P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt pilots, flying escort and strike missions, soon realized its secondary advantage. Once radar screens were blinded, the Luftwaffe's fighter control network collapsed. German interceptors no longer received accurate vectors. Instead of coordinated interceptions, they scrambled blindly, often into ambushes. Radar-controlled flak guns wasted ammunition firing at shadows, leaving real aircraft unscathed. By mid-1944, the Allies refined window into entire operations. The British called these mandrel screens, airborne curtains of chaff laid by dedicated aircraft ahead of bomber streams. In the hours before a raid, squadrons of B-24s or B-17s would fly at high altitude, seeding vast corridors of window that jammed German radar for hundreds of miles. Beneath that electronic storm, the real strike groups could move freely, unseen, untracked, and deadly. German engineers understood exactly what was happening. They even developed mathematical filters to try to distinguish chaff from real aircraft. But it was too late. The problem wasn't technical anymore. It was psychological. Every radar operator now lived with doubt. Was that formation real or just aluminum ghosts? Was that silent safety or another deception? In the months that followed, radar stations reported hundreds of phantom raids. Fighter units launched to intercept fleets that never existed. Entire regions went on alert for attacks that never came. And when the real ones did, the Mustangs sweeping low, their guns flashing over airfields, the radars were blind. The warning never came, and the Luftwaffe's last strength bled away on the ground. By the summer of 1944, window was no longer just a weapon. It was a philosophy of warfare, one that said victory belonged not only to those who could strike the hardest, but to those who could vanish first. The human blindness, when Germany's eyes went dark. In every war, there comes a moment when a soldier realizes the rules have changed, when the familiar world of cause and effect collapses. For the men who sat in Germany's radar bunkers in 1944, that moment arrived not with a bang, but with silence. They were technicians, not frontline soldiers. Most had never fired a rifle in anger. Their battlefield was the glowing circle of a cathode ray screen, a pulsing green heartbeat that represented the sky. The radar station was their fortress, and the signal trace was their compass. As long as the scope spoke, they could predict, direct, and defend. Then came window. It began as a flicker, then a flood. The radar echoes multiplied until the entire screen was a snowstorm of light. Operators adjusted their dials, recalibrated frequencies, changed gain settings. Nothing helped. Every time they cleared one signal, 3 more appeared. The radio chatter from neighboring stations was the same. Seeing hundreds, no, thousands. Targets. Heading east. Nwauchituji. Can't confirm, the duty officer shouted for verification from spotters. Spotters saw nothing. The searchlights swung through empty air. Anti-aircraft guns fired into nothingness. Somewhere in the confusion, the meaning of the word contact began to dissolve. One Luftwaffe radar operator later recalled, "It was as if the sky had turned to mirrors. You could see everything, and nothing was real." For crews trained to trust their machines, the psychological toll was devastating. Radar was not just equipment, it was faith made visible. It was the belief that science could bring order to war, and now that faith was crumbling one false echo at a time. As window fell over France and Holland, some radar stations simply stopped reporting. Others continued out of habit, sending up constant streams of contradictory data. Controllers at command posts tried to merge it all into a coherent picture, but the picture no longer existed. What had once been a synchronized defense network, a masterpiece of coordination, had become chaos rendered in electrons. The night fighter crews who depended on those signals felt it first. Pilots climbed into their Ju-88s and Bf-110s expecting the calm, mechanical voice of the controller in their ears. "Turn right, altitude 8,000, enemy ahead." Instead, they heard silence or confusion. Some were guided toward massive bomber streams that didn't exist. Others found themselves diving through flak fired by their own guns, chasing ghosts on a dark horizon. The psychological collapse was gradual but unstoppable. Each failed interception, each false alarm, chipped away at confidence. In the ready rooms, pilots muttered that their machines had betrayed them. Technicians stopped trusting their instruments. Commanders began to second-guess their own orders. The once mighty radar network, the Shield of the Reich, was rotting from the inside out. And when the real attacks came, the sense of helplessness was total. Radar operators would later describe the most haunting detail: the sound. Not of explosions, but of engines. The moment when, after hours of staring at static and false echoes, they finally heard the deep, rolling thunder of aircraft overhead. Too late. That was when they knew the ghosts had turned real. Outside, the night would erupt with gunfire and flame. Bombs fell on airfields and fuel depots. P-51 Mustangs strafed hangars, their guns flashing in bursts of light. And in the bunkers, the radar screens still flickered. Blind, glowing, beautiful, and useless. To the men inside, it must have felt like going deaf and blind at once. Trapped in a storm of light they themselves could not see. They weren't just losing a battle. They were watching the future outpace them. Because in that moment, they understood what few in the world yet realized. The next war wouldn't be won by those who saw the enemy first, but by those who could make the enemy see nothing at all. The tactical masterpiece. How Window turned the sky into a trap. For the Allied planners sitting in the war rooms of High Wycombe and East Anglia, radar was never just an enemy system. It was a language to be rewritten. They didn't want to destroy German radar. They wanted to make it lie. By mid-1944, Window had evolved from a desperate experiment into a weapon of strategy, one that could shape entire battles without firing a single shot. The Royal Air Force and the U.S. 8th Air Force began to coordinate deception raids, blending technology, timing, and psychology into a single deadly choreography. The first step was control. Dropping chaff randomly caused chaos, but when deployed in patterns, Window could paint whatever illusion the Allies desired. Bombers carried bundles pre-cut to match German radar frequencies. Navigators released them at precise intervals, building shimmering corridors of false aircraft. Operators called them carpets or clouds. On a German scope, they appeared as dense, shifting rivers of returns, each one indistinguishable from a real formation. American Mustang groups soon learned to use those carpets like camouflage. As bomber streams advanced toward Germany, escorting P-51 squadrons peeled away and slipped under window clouds, dropping to low altitude. German radar followed the bright ghost fleets marching east while the real fighters vanished beneath the static. Minutes later, those same Mustangs would erupt over Luftwaffe airfields, their guns blazing before the first siren wailed. It was precision deception on an industrial scale. Each mission was plotted to the second. Mandrel jamming aircraft flew ahead to distort the radar picture. Window corridors masked the true vector of attack. And as the radars drowned in false echoes, Fighter Command's 100th and 352nd Groups, elite P-51 units, struck from below, targeting runways, parked aircraft, and fuel depots. German controllers, watching the chaos unfold, tried to adapt. They called in interceptors from distant sectors, convinced that massive raids were approaching their cities. But when those fighters took off, they found empty skies, while their own airfields were shredded by strafing Mustangs that had slipped through the clutter unseen. By the time reality caught up, it was too late. To the Americans, the tactic became known simply as window cover. It was the invisible shield that turned every raid into a two-front battle. One fought on the radar screen, the other in the air. For the first time, Allied air power was not just physical, but mathematical, measured in angles, wavelengths, and seconds. The Luftwaffe never found a real counter. Filters could remove some echoes, but not enough. Changing frequencies only delayed the inevitable. The Allies adjusted their foil lengths overnight, and jamming the jammers was impossible. The Germans were chasing ghosts born from their own reflections. To Allied pilots, it felt almost unfair. Mustang squadrons described missions where they crossed entire sectors unchallenged, their approach hidden under drifting window. When they emerged over an airfield, the enemy was still scrambling, gunners firing wildly into the sky, Convinced the main attack was elsewhere, the P-51's role transformed. Once built to escort bombers, it became a precision strike weapon, the blade following the shadow. In the space of a few months, Window turned the fighter from guardian to predator, from defender to assassin. The British called it electronic warfare. The Germans called it black magic. Both were right, because the real victory of Window wasn't in the destruction it caused, but in the illusion it created. The Luftwaffe was forced to fight what it could no longer see, and in doing so, it exhausted itself chasing mirages. By the summer of 1944, as the Allies prepared for the great daylight offensives that would cripple the Reich's last defenses, Window wasn't just a tool, it was doctrine. Every major raid, every Mustang sweep, every deception before D-Day began with a handful of foil tumbling silently through the air. Invisible, weightless, and unstoppable. The weapon that blinded an empire. Operation over France, the day the radars went silent. July 1944. Northern France. The wheat fields were golden, the air heavy with summer haze. In the early dawn, farmers near Rouen looked up as distant thunder rolled across the sky. It was not weather. It was war, coming in waves. From England's southeastern coast, the 8th Air Force had launched one of its most ambitious daylight operations yet. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s were heading for German fuel depots and rail yards deep in occupied France. Above them, at 25,000 feet, silver specks gleamed in the morning light. P-51 Mustangs, their long noses glinting like knives. They weren't just escorts today. They were hunters. Before the bombers even crossed the channel, the first phase of the operation began. From specially equipped B-24s flying ahead of the main formation, crewmen pushed open hatches and tossed out bundles wrapped in brown paper. Each packet burst open as it fell, releasing hundreds of thin aluminum strips that spread across the wind. Within minutes, the sky was filled with them, drifting, swirling, catching the light like falling snow. The German radar stations along the coast of Calais and Dieppe immediately reacted. Operators who had stared at empty screens moments earlier now saw massive formations filling their scopes. Dozens of false bomber streams appeared, some heading north, others south. Confused by the sudden surge, commanders dispatched fighters to intercept what they believed was a three-pronged attack. But those formations were ghosts, clouds of Window. The real bombers were still 50 miles away, approaching through a corridor of silence that the Germans couldn't see. At Aire-sur-la-Lys, a key Luftwaffe radar and night fighter base, the control center descended into chaos. Telephones rang non-stop. Commanders demanded position fixes that couldn't be verified. The radar picture flickered between blinding brightness and empty black. Technicians tried to filter the clutter by changing frequency bands, but the clutter followed. It was as if the entire atmosphere had turned metallic. By the time the radar net began to recover, it was already too late. Out of the haze came the sound of engines. Low, fast, relentless. A formation of P-51 Mustangs of the 332nd Fighter Group swept in barely 100 feet off the ground. Their approach had been completely masked by Window. The radar station never saw them. Anti-aircraft guns fired in panic, but the fighters were already diving, 8 at a time, their .650 caliber machine guns spitting fire across the airfield. Hangars erupted in flame. Fuel trucks exploded in fountains of black smoke. Parked FW-190s and BF-109s burned like torches. Mechanics ran for cover, and the control tower vanished in a burst of tracer rounds. The Mustangs roared through, climbed slightly, circled, and came back again. The attack lasted just 6 minutes, but it ended months of German effort to hold the line in northern France. At nearby radar outposts, operators listening over their headphones heard the static flatten into silence. The screens went blank, power lines severed, antennas destroyed. For the first time since 1940, that sector of the Luftwaffe's radar chain was completely blind. The surviving reports from German command describe the moment with understated terror. Enemy fighters attacked without warning. Radar stations reported no contacts. Communications lost within 2 minutes. System failure total. When the Mustangs rejoined the bombers over the channel on their return leg, they left behind a trail of burning airfields and crippled defenses. Allied reconnaissance photos taken later that day showed more than 60 German aircraft destroyed on the ground, most never having left their hangars. In the intelligence offices back in England, analysts pored over radar intercept logs. Every station between Cherbourg and Ghent had reported massive phantom raids hours before the real one. The deception had worked perfectly. To the crews who flew it, the mission felt like a glimpse of the future. One Mustang pilot described it in his log. "We flew in plain sight, but to their machines, we were ghosts." It was like fighting in another dimension. That day, Window proved something extraordinary. You didn't have to destroy the enemy's eyes, you only had to convince them they saw too much. The collapse of the Luftwaffe's eyes, the day deception. Won the sky. By nightfall on July 7, 1944, the entire radar defense grid across northern France was in chaos. From Cherbourg to Lille, operators sent frantic, contradictory messages to Luftwaffe command. Multiple formations approaching, now vanished. Echoes everywhere, cannot distinguish real from false. All stations reporting overload, request instructions. There were no instructions left to give. The Kammhuber line, once the most advanced air defense network on Earth, had become a wall of noise. What had begun as a single Allied deception had cascaded into system-wide blindness. At Saint-Omer, headquarters for JAG Division 2, the chief radar officer watched as his entire air picture disintegrated. The plotting boards, once clean and orderly, now showed hundreds of markers drifting in every direction. Interceptors were scrambled toward phantom raids, burning precious fuel while the real attackers struck undefended sectors. Reports of visual contact contradicted radar data. Radar data contradicted everything. The radio frequencies themselves were filled with interference. Mandrel jammers adding to the chaos. German controllers shouted through static, their voices distorted beyond recognition. One technician later wrote, "It was like trying to listen for footsteps in a hurricane." And above that hurricane, the P-51 Mustangs moved with impunity. The 357th Fighter Group hit Cambrai, strafing airstrips and railway yards. The 355th attacked Leon, destroying fuel dumps hidden among hangars. Every strike had been pre-planned to coincide with window releases, each one timed so that the Luftwaffe's radar picture collapsed just before the Mustangs appeared. The Germans were being hit faster than they could understand what was happening. By the time the first real radar echoes began to reappear as the chaff clouds drifted east or fell to the ground, the battle was over. The airfields were burning. The radar dishes themselves were twisted, blackened wrecks. A single Mustang squadron had wiped out 3 installations in a single sortie. Luftwaffe High Command, desperate to make sense of the reports, summoned their best electronic experts from Berlin. They examined surviving logs and found something chilling. There had never been any mechanical failure. The systems had worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. Window had simply used physics against them. Each strip of aluminum foil had reflected the same radar wavelength the Freya and Würzburg sets transmitted. The radar had seen everything, just not the truth. It was a perfect inversion. The Germans had built a network to control the sky, and now that same technology was feeding them illusions. The result was catastrophic beyond the physical damage. Radar crews began ignoring real warnings, assuming they were false. Anti-aircraft batteries hesitated to open fire, fearing they'd waste ammunition on ghosts. Confidence, the invisible glue that held the air defense system together, was gone. By the end of the month, internal reports from Luftwaffe headquarters in Paris painted a bleak picture. Radar efficiency across the Western Front had dropped by 80%. Average interception time had fallen from 12 minutes to less than 4. Far too little to mount a defense. The German fighter arm, already exhausted by attrition and fuel shortages, was now fighting blind. And yet the full horror of what had happened took time to sink in. Many officers couldn't believe the cause. Aluminum strips? Could something so absurd have brought down a system that had taken years to build? But the data left no doubt. What made it worse was that the Allies kept changing the rhythm, altering frequencies, varying drop altitudes, mixing window with radio jamming. There was no pattern to adapt to, no defense to devise. Every adjustment the Germans made became irrelevant by the next raid. It was like trying to fight a shadow that learned faster than you did. A Luftwaffe signals officer captured after the war put it simply. We realized too late that we were not fighting pilots anymore. We were fighting mathematicians. In the burned-out remains of radar bunkers along the French coast, the silence afterward was absolute. The machines were dark, the screens cold. The operators sat in the dim light of emergency lamps, staring at the circles where once the war had glowed in green. They no longer trusted what they saw, and that meant they could no longer fight. Above them, the Allies owned the daylight, and with each mission, each packet of chaff drifting through the summer air, the myth of German invincibility, of precision, of technological superiority, unraveled strip by strip. That day, the sky itself had turned against them. When the machines went silent, the end of Germany's radar war. By the late summer of 1944, Germany's once proud radar defense had become a shell of flickering lights and broken faith. What the Allies destroyed in hangars and airfields was visible. What they destroyed in mines was not. For the first time since the war began, the Luftwaffe no longer trusted its own eyes. Across Western Europe, the Kammhuber Line, the intricate network of Freya and Würzburg radars, searchlights and command posts, collapsed in slow motion. It had been designed as an orchestra of precision, each station passing targets to the next, guiding night fighters through seamless handoffs. Now, the symphony had dissolved into static. Every instrument played a different song. Engineers tried to fight back. They introduced Nuremberg filters to separate chaff from real echoes, experimented with frequency-hopping transmitters, even shortened radar pulses to distinguish moving aircraft from drifting foil. But each fix only worked for days. The Allies adapted instantly. New lengths of window, new release intervals, new jamming frequencies. The race was no longer about hardware. It was about thinking faster than the enemy. And Germany, once the teacher of electronic warfare, had become its pupil. The psychological shift was devastating. Luftwaffe night fighter groups, once elite, confident, and data-driven, now launched missions on instinct. Some squadrons refused to scramble unless spotters confirmed visual contact. Others fired flak blindly at radar phantoms, wasting ammunition as Allied formations slipped overhead untouched. What had been a science became superstition. For Allied planners, the success was staggering. Window wasn't just protecting bombers, it was rewriting the rules of the air war. Missions that once required entire wings of escort fighters could now rely on deception alone. A few packets of foil could achieve what once demanded hundreds of guns. The U.S. 8th Air Force turned the tactic into doctrine. Before every major raid, mandrel jammers and carpet aircraft laid vast curtains of interference, window-seated confusion across radar corridors hundreds of miles wide. Beneath that chaos, P-51s and B-17s operated in mathematical harmony, timed to the minute, invisible to the scope. Allied commanders began referring to the electromagnetic spectrum as the new front line. And in the ruins of German radar stations, Allied investigators found the clearest evidence of victory. Notes of despair. Logs filled with lines like "unidentifiable echoes continue," "cannot track," or "system failure unexplained." The enemy had not been beaten by firepower alone, but by doubt. That doubt spread through the Luftwaffe's hierarchy like rust. Interceptor command couldn't coordinate. Coastal defense couldn't predict. Even the mighty flak towers of Hamburg and Berlin began firing without orders, their radars showing hundreds of ghosts. The confidence that once defined German technology, the certainty that mathematics and machinery would prevail, was gone. Meanwhile, Allied scientists were already thinking ahead. If thin foil could blind radar, then perhaps radio waves could be shaped, redirected, or silenced entirely. The seed of the modern concept of electronic countermeasures had taken root. Window had proved that information itself could be a weapon, one as decisive as any bomb or bullet. By September 1944, as Allied troops pushed across France, the Luftwaffe's radar chain was effectively dead. Its operators either fled or surrendered. Those who stayed behind watched helplessly as their once perfect instruments turned to static while the sky thundered with American engines. The age of certainty, when radar ruled the night, was over. What replaced it was a new kind of warfare, fought not for ground or sky, but for truth itself, from aluminum to algorithms, the birth of the invisible war. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the lessons of Window didn't fade with the smoke. They deepened. What had begun as a desperate trick to confuse radar operators had become the foundation of a new kind of warfare. One fought not with armor and artillery, but with signals, deception, and silence. In Allied research centers across Britain and America, scientists dissected the success of Window. They saw more than a weapon. They saw a principle. If you can control what the enemy sees, you can control what the enemy does. This realization gave birth to a revolution. Laboratories at Malvern, Farnborough, and the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory began studying ways to not just blind radar, but to outthink it. They developed active jammers that emitted false echoes, systems that mimicked aircraft signatures, and techniques to shape the radar cross-section of planes. In time, these experiments would lead directly to the creation of radar-absorbent coatings, ECM pods, and, decades later, the stealth aircraft of the Cold War. Every strand of that lineage traced back to one invention, the handful of silver strips that turned the sky into a hall of mirrors. Even the name survived. Chaff, as Window came to be called after the war, became standard issue for every Air Force on Earth. Jets from Korea to Vietnam carried cartridges that could scatter metal fragments into the sky, creating the same shimmering illusions that once blinded German radar. The physics hadn't changed, only the scale. And yet, the moral legacy of Window was as profound as its scientific one. It blurred the line between truth and falsehood in combat. No longer was victory a matter of outgunning the enemy. It was about outknowing them. The battle for air supremacy had become a battle for perception itself. Historians would later say that Window was the first true information weapon, a tool that didn't destroy machines, but belief in machines. Its power lay not in metal or fire, but in confusion. It taught the Allies that invisibility was the highest form of strength, that the unseen could be more devastating than the visible. By 1945, the technology of radar had advanced light years, but so too had the art of making it useless. Every radar pulse sent into the sky carried a quiet reminder of the lesson Germany had learned too late. Seeing isn't knowing, and somewhere in a museum or hangar, under the wings of a preserved P-51 or Lancaster, sits a small packet of dull gray foil, the simplest, cheapest, most elegant deception ever built. It needed no engine, no fuse, no power source. It floated, reflected, and rewrote the future. That future would belong to those who could make an army disappear with mathematics. The quietest revolution in war. War often remembers the noise, the roar of engines, the thunder of bombs, the cries of victory and loss. But the greatest revolutions sometimes arrive in silence. In the summer of 1944, as millions fought across Europe, the balance of power shifted not with a superweapon or a secret army, but with silence on a radar screen, a blank circle where truth used to live. The German operators who stared into that silence didn't know it then, but they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of battlefield, one where the goal was not to destroy the enemy's body but to erase their perception, to make them fight shadows, ghosts, and noise. Window was the first whisper of that future. A handful of foil drifting through the air had undone the most advanced detection network of its time. It didn't need to explode. It only needed to confuse, and confusion in a war built on precision was fatal. From that day on, warfare would never again be fought by sight alone. Every radar pulse, every electronic signal, every satellite transmission would carry a question born in those dark German bunkers. Is what I see real? That question has never left the modern battlefield. It echoes in every stealth bomber's shadow, every jamming wave, every digital deception launched into invisible air. The men who invented Window could not have imagined what they had started. They only knew they were fighting to survive, and that in doing so they had turned knowledge itself into a weapon. When history looks back at the Second World War, it often sees tanks, battleships, and bombs. But somewhere in that storm of iron and fire, a few strips of aluminum taught humanity a quieter, deeper truth, that the greatest power in war is not to strike first, but to make the enemy blind before they even know you are there.